Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island and we're discussing critical approaches, critical perspectives, and today we're discussing reader response. You'll remember that cultural criticism is a critical perspective that essentially says that a work can be translated from the belief system of a group of people who share the same belief. This is a religion, a culture, an ethnicity, whatever it happens to be. And your secondary source material is going to be resources that essentially explain how these people see the world and how they see things, and therefore you would use that to then translate the work. However, there's another approach to this that essentially would say that there is a way to look at work that is not based on belief system, but rather how someone responds to something because of an experience that they may have had. And these experiences become less about cultural belief and more about the fact that the individual, having had this particular iconic or individual experience, is going to translate a work in a way that others may not. Reader response is a critical perspective that essentially says that there is a dialogue between the author and the reader of the work, and no matter what the author intends, that reader is going to translate things in particular ways, and very often that particular way is going to be affected by something that has happened to or concerning the reader that will affect the way they read something and perceive it and decide whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, etc. For example, if a person is watching a movie, and in the movie there is criminal behavior, there is a burglar who breaks into a house, and then that burglar surprises the owner of the house, and then assaults that person, and then leaves. Different reader responses are going to translate this work in a different way. For example, you could certainly from a cultural perspective say, well, from the culture of the police, and then you have their belief system explained, they would translate this as a crime scene, they would look for particular evidence, they would treat the victims in a particular way, and when they arrested the perpetrator, they would treat this person in a particular way. But reader response would look at this a little bit more closely and perhaps translate this, for example, from the perspective of a person who has been the victim of crime, either a burglary or of physical violence, violent crime. They would translate things in a fundamentally different way than someone who has not gone through that experience. Now, many people have gone through the experience of being victims of violent crime, being victims of burglary, but they don't share a culture per se. The only thing that they have in common is that they've all had this particular experience. And you can certainly find secondary sources, usually psychological journals, sociological journals, in which it is explained as to what this person who's had this experience will feel in terms of flashbacks, in terms of how they respond to the situation, in terms of who they empathize with, etc. And so it's not really a culture per se as much as an experiential kind of thing. And you would find your secondary source material and say a person who's been a victim of violent crime would immediately be threatened by what they observe. They would relive perhaps their own experience as it's happening to the character on the screen, and they would really want some kind of either, depending on the resource you find, some kind of vengeance, some kind of justice, whatever it happens to be, and you would incorporate those into how they would translate the work. Conversely, you could find someone who, you could find a reader response from someone who's a criminal and how they would perceive the situation. And certainly, again, go through the same process of finding resources that discuss the criminal thought, the criminal behavior, and their mentality, and define what that is. You know, police and criminals are, in some ways, are a culture of sorts, but also you could look at it as a reader response issue, whereas the person who's been victimized by crime specifically would be a good reader response analysis. If the work was originally intended by the author to be some kind of story about how the police are ineffective, or how the criminal has some kind of higher motive, maybe they're stealing to, you know, feed their grandmother or something along those lines, that story is going to be missed by somebody who's been a victim of crime, because they're going to say they don't really care, and they're completely unsympathetic with the motivations of someone who has stolen their material or who has assaulted them. And so this is where the author, trying to reach the characters, reach the audience through these particular characters, is going to miss this particular audience, because this particular audience is going to say, despite what you think you're writing, this is not really what it's about. A reader response really needs a secondary source material that explains how people who have experienced a particular thing that is also in the work, in the primary work, the poem, the play, the movie, the story, whatever it happens to be, and how they would respond to that particular episode. And in some ways you can, if you want, then pull in what the author's intention was and see whether or not there's a disconnect between those two things. The main thing I want to see on your papers, however, is that response, is how that individual would respond. And again, cultural, you're going to find an entire group of people who all believe the same thing and translate that way. But with reader response, it's really that individual experience that defines their response to a particular work. Find your secondary sources and see if you can apply it. Stay in touch.